Hi, and welcome to the end of week 4 and what we are going to try and do in week 5. Week 4 is pretty much in the books, except for the Monday night game against the Raiders against the Chargers in LA. Now, some keys I'm going to be looking at tonight is how healthy is Josh Jacobs going to be if he even plays. He's not a lock at this point. They say they're going to run him out there and see how he feels. If he's not able to go, I hope you have a alternate. Either Peyton Barber or Kenyon Drake, to me, are valid replacements. Let's see if Mike Williams can continue his hot streak. One of the things I kind of looked at with Mike Williams going into the season was I thought he was pretty inefficient. And one of the reasons he was inefficient was he always had a pretty deep average depth of target. Last year, he caught about 55% of his passes, and his ADOT was around 14 and a half yards. The only guy that was higher with at least 80 targets was Nelson Aguilar, who had a similar catch percentage of his targets. The guy that kind of thrives in that range is Calvin Ridley, and neither Aguilar or Mike Williams are Calvin Ridley. So I kind of said, I hope Mike Williams gets down to a ADOT closer to, say, Mike Evans, about 11 and a half to 12 yards. And so far this year, Mike Williams has a 9.3 ADOT. And I think Mike Williams is a guy I want to get the ball in his hands and watch him make plays. So to see an ADOT that shallow where he can catch 65, 70% or more of his targets is just ideal, especially in that offense. And the last thing I want to look at tonight is which side is going to break. The Las Vegas offense that's averaging 30 points a game, or the Chargers defense that's allowing about 20 points a game. See if the Raiders can either make that a shootout or if the Chargers can keep it more low scoring. Of course, as fantasy players, we're absolutely, definitely tuned into the shootout option. Let's look at some of the news for the week. Both of the New York teams got their first wins in overtime yesterday. The Giants came back from 21-10 down with less than 7 minutes left. One of the biggest plays was Saquon Barkley getting behind the defense for a 54-yard touchdown reception. And then there were a couple of big plays on both the game-tying drive and the winning drive to Kenny Golladay, which was good to see. And in a absolute back-and-forth shootout, the Jets pulled out a win when a Tennessee kicker, Randy Bullock, missed a 49-yarder in overtime to give the Jets their first win. Couple of things I want to note in the statistics category. There are 4 players that have 5 combined rushing and or receiving touchdowns this year, and 2 of them are probably guys you wouldn't expect. Carolina quarterback Sam Darnold leads the NFL in rushing touchdowns right now with 5, and that is also the league lead for total touchdowns that aren't passes. And also, Cordero Patterson has been amazingly efficient, and he is also tied for the touchdown lead with 5. Now, let's talk about some of the injuries that happened yesterday, and there were a bunch of them. I mentioned previously that I thought if I'm playing if my guys are playing against Tampa Bay, I definitely want to start my receivers. And they lost 2 more defensive backs yesterday. Carlton Davis injured a quad, and he had already been dealing with a hamstring injury. And it's going to be interesting to see if he's able to come back in week 5. I think probably not. Antoine Winfield, the safety, also got a concussion. They have already signed Richard Sherman to replace Jamel Dean, and they are absolutely hurting in their defensive backfield. There's just not enough bodies right now. So if they have an Achilles injury on defense, it's certainly not their rushing defense. New England found that out the hard way last night when they ran the ball 8 times and did not even get 0 yards. I believe they had -1 yards rushing. Washington lost some receivers yesterday. Tight end Logan Thomas injured his hamstring early in the game and did not return. Wide receiver Diami Brown injured a knee and left the game. And wide receiver Cam Sims also injured a hamstring, which seems to be the theme of the season. There are a lot of hamstring injuries. I'm not crazy about any of the replacements on Washington as far as receivers go. To me, the guys to own there are Terry McLaurin, J.D. McKissick, Antonio Gibson, and if you're in a deep league, quarterback Taylor Heineke. So I'm not looking to replace any of those guys. I doubt outside of Thomas, I'd be looking to another team to replace him. Ricky Seals-Jones did most of the playing after Logan Thomas got hurt, but I'm not excited about picking him up. One of the bigger injuries yesterday was the Bears running back David Montgomery hurting a knee, and he looked to be in quite a bit of pain. There's been no update that I've seen to this point, but I would expect him to be at best week to week. They don't think he tore an ACL, but the fact that they even are going to be testing for that is not good news. The guy to own right now, if Montgomery has to miss time, is Damian Williams is probably my favorite, and I would probably spend a decent amount of my fab to get him or a fairly high waiver pick. But another guy to keep an eye on that may be coming back in the next 3 to 5 weeks is Tariq Cohen. Tariq Cohen got a very lucrative contract from the Bears to play for them. And I think if he's healthy right now, he's on the physically unable to perform list. But I think when he's healthy, he's going to get some usage. So that's a name to keep an eye on. If you've got a IR spot, you may want to pick him up and put him in there. In Denver, Bridgewater got a concussion yesterday and was lifted late in the first half, and Drew Lock replaced him. Keep an eye on how long, if at all, that Teddy Bridgewater is going to be out. As soon as he gets back, he's going to get that job back. Drew Lock played yesterday. It was against the Ravens, who gave Denver a tough time. But Drew Lock doesn't look like he's learned much in the time he's been in the league. I always thought he could be a Brett Favre type, but so far he's only been the bad part of Brett Favre, the gunslinger that makes poor decisions and throws a lot of interceptions. Wide receiver Deontay Spencer, who's not one of the core wide receivers, but with Jerry Jeudy and KJ Hamler already out, he has a role, and he has a chest injury. Keep an eye on that. And first-round pick cornerback Patrick Surtain injured his chest yesterday. I heard this morning that's a day-to-day injury, so he may not miss any time. But if he does, that hurts their overall defense and especially their passing defense just a bit. A couple of big injuries in San Francisco. Jimmy Garoppolo, the quarterback, injured his calf. Apparently somebody stepped on it. And at first they were calling it week to week. Now it sounds like he's going to miss a couple of weeks. In one quarterback leagues, I'm not super excited about Trey Lance. He does give you some rushing upside and long touchdown upside, but I don't know that he's going to be a decent enough possession quarterback to be valuable from week to week. Left tackle Trent Williams injured a shoulder and left the game. That's a huge injury if he misses any time. He's one of the best left tackles in the game, and he is being paid like it. So keep an eye on injury reports to see if he misses any time. It definitely downgrades their offense if he does. And kicker Robbie Gould disappeared. He apparently injured a hamstring. I'm not even sure when. I watched most of the game, but he did not really handle any of the kicking duties yesterday. I don't care one way or another from week to week if Robbie Gould's out there or not. I don't think the 49ers are a high enough scoring offense to warrant owning their kicker, especially with Jimmy Garoppolo out. For Green Bay, cornerback Jair Alexander. It sounds like he sprained an AC joint, which is a shoulder injury that can be very painful. Now, if he can manage the pain, he may not miss any time. But if he does miss some time, that definitely is a downgrade to their pass. A wide receiver, Will Fuller for the Dolphins, hurt a hand and did not return to the game yesterday. And I will talk a little bit more about Will Fuller in a later segment of the show. Edge rusher Romeo Okwara for the Lions sounds like he ruptured his Achilles and will be out for the year. I mentioned somewhere, may have been here, may have just been on Twitter, that as unspecial as their secondary is, they have been able to generate pressure this year. And if Okwara is out for the year, that's definitely going to hurt them. And it's wheels up for pretty much any offense against their defense. A backup running back for the Saints, Tony Jones, was carted off with an ankle injury yesterday. I'm not really interested in anybody on that team right now outside of Alvin Kamara. They're not throwing the ball enough. I think Jameis Winston has maybe 87 pass attempts through 4 games. They are the leading rushing percentage of total play, offensive play teams in the league right now, and I never thought I would say that about the Saints. Alvin Kamara had 26 carries for 120 yards yesterday and 0 targets. And a little bit of a funny anecdote is I saw a tweet last week saying that Joe Mixon was being used like Derrick Henry, which for Mixon. Well, Alvin Kamara is in kind of the same boat right now. And that's even worse news for Alvin Kamara. Most people draft Alvin Kamara for his receiving upside, not for his rushing upside. Buffalo got a bad injury on the defense if he is forced to miss some time. Linebacker Matt Milano injured a hamstring. And that is always a troubling injury. And last year when Matt Milano went down, their defense was very, very much ineffective. Now, they did manage to finish a shutout of the Houston Texans yesterday, but that was the Houston Texans. I think I'm starting defenses against Houston, and I will talk about that again later in the show. With Julio Jones and A.J. Brown out for the Titans, they really could not afford any more receivers. But wide receiver Josh Reynolds, who had not been doing much up to this point, was actually seeing some looks yesterday before he hurt his knee. Hopefully one or all of those guys can come back because Ryan Tannehill is already struggling. And I will also talk about that situation. Now, I did not mention earlier the Thursday night game. There were 2 critical injuries in that game. Jacksonville wide receiver DJ Chark broke his ankle, and he looks like he will be out most of the season, if not all of the season. If you are holding DJ Chark, don't. I think he's probably not going to be back until near the end of the fantasy season or into the playoffs. I wouldn't tie up a roster spot, even an IR spot, for that long. I'd let him go. If somebody else wants to tie up their IR spot, let them. And Joe Mixon hurt an ankle. And if that is true, that he misses time, I would expect some work to go to Samaje Perine and probably some of the passing game work to go to Chris Evans. I'm not super excited about either guy. I'm hoping T. Higgins can be back soon because I think that will swing the Cincinnati offense if Mixon's out, because they've been running the ball a lot. They don't run a lot of plays overall, and Mixon's been getting a lot of work. And I would be much more interested to see Joe Burrow throw the ball more, especially with those talented receivers they have. One of the week 4 heroes was tight end CJ Uzoma, and that's not a guy that I'm really looking to add. Sure, I put him on my watch list, see if he can string together a few games like some of the other tight ends. Okay, let's talk about some potential drops to make room on your roster for the waiver ads that I'm going to recommend in a little bit. If you are holding quarterback Ryan Tannehill, and I would imagine in a lot of one quarterback leagues, Ryan Tannehill was a popular target if you didn't want to spend a high draft pick on a quarterback. But Ryan Tannehill currently is playing for a team that has got injured receivers, is very inefficient on offense, and he has only got 6 touchdowns through 4 games, including a rushing touchdown, and he's got 6 turnovers. I would absolutely consider dropping Ryan Tannehill in 1 QB leagues. And if for any reason at all you really went deep and drafted Baker Mayfield based on his second half last year, I'm thinking, if you haven't moved on already, most people have. He's only got 3 TDs so far this year. That is a true running team. They are one of only 2 teams that for the year has more than 50% of their total plays being, their total offensive plays, I should say, being rushing plays. You can do away with Baker Mayfield. Now, I'm always not excited to say drop running backs, but there are 3 names I'm going to give you that I think are death. One of them was only a depth piece to begin with, but I think a couple of the other guys were looked at as potential starters. And I avoided up to this point saying drop Ronald Jones, but I am going to flat out say drop Ronald Jones this week if you're still holding him for any reason. Through 4 games, he only has 22 touches. He's not being used in the passing game. He did have 25 yards on 6 touches and a touchdown last week. So if you're truly desperate and you want to bury him on the end of the bench, go ahead. I personally am not. I would rather have another receiver that I could put in my flex spot than a guy that really isn't doing anything. As long as Darrell Henderson was going to be out, Sony Michel was going to have some value. And I would say, hang on to him. But Darrell Henderson's back. He managed to get almost all of the running back touches yesterday. Sony Michel had 3 carries, don't even remember how many yards, maybe 11, and a lost fumble. So if you actually flexed him yesterday, expecting him to get some run, he got you negative points. And Darrell Henderson's the guy to own in that backfield. Again, if you're in a really deep league and you want to bury Michel on the end of your bench, feel free. Tyson Williams has gone from maybe being the starter in Baltimore to 5 carries in week 3 and being a healthy scratch in week 4. And they look like they are going to be going with Latavius Murray getting most of the running back touches going forward. So if you're holding Tyson Williams and you need a roster spot, drop him. Unqualified, drop him. I'm probably going to wind up dropping him myself in the leagues I'm holding him. Now, looking at wide receivers, there are 2 guys I would consider dropping. And the first one got hurt yesterday, had a hand injury in the Miami game. And Will Fuller, even though he has been back a couple of weeks, has not done much. And I'm not real crazy about that passing offense, even when Tua Tagovailoa comes back. The guys I want on that passing offense are probably Devontae Parker, Jalen Waddle, and Mike Gesicki. And even Waddle only had 4 targets and 3 receptions yesterday. Another name I haven't mentioned on their offense that I would consider dropping and may actually recommend it next week is Myles Gaskin. You probably spent a fairly high draft choice on him. But right now, we're just talking about Will Fuller. If you are getting buried, if you're in a dire situation, you're 0-3, maybe even looking at 0-4, I don't think you can afford to have Will Fuller on your roster. And I mentioned DJ Chark breaking his ankle. He's a drop to me. As far as tight ends go, one guy I would look on dropping to make room for a couple of the guys that I am going to recommend is Robert Tonyan. I know a lot of people are going to go, well, no, but Robert Tonyan so far this year has got 1 touchdown. And the thing that made him so effective last year was he had lots of touchdowns. If he isn't getting touchdowns, he's probably not getting the ball a lot at all. And I know he had 7 targets yesterday, but those turned into 2 receptions for 8 yards. And out of 4 games, 3 of his games are less than 3 PPR points. And that is just death to a roster. So if you're in a shallower league, maybe even a deeper league, I would consider replacing Robert Tonyan, and I'll give you a couple of names that I would consider coming up a little bit later in this show. Okay, let's talk about some of the guys I gave you last week and how they did. I recommended Sam Darnold last week, and I've already talked about how well he did. He had 301 yards passing. He had 35 yards rushing. He had 2 passing touchdowns, 2 more rushing touchdowns. As I said, he is the rushing touchdown leader for the NFL. He did have 2 interceptions. That doesn't hurt you too much in most leagues. So to me, I'm recommending Darnold again this week. On the flip side of the coin, I recommended at least watching Royce Freeman. And of course, everybody was going to pick up Chuba Hubbard with Christian McCaffrey out. And that was just a bad game script. Neither guy had a lot of touches. I think Chuba had 15 touches. Didn't turn into any rushing touchdown. All the rushing touchdowns are going to Darnold for the most part on that team. But I'm still holding Chuba. I would expect McCaffrey. He's definitely going to be out again this week. It's possible he comes back next week. I would think probably a better target might be week 7. But keep your eye on it. But as long as he's out, Chuba's a hold. And Freeman is still a watch. And if you're feeling extra cautious, maybe even a pickup, just to see if anything happens to Chuba. God forbid. I never root for injuries. I gave you Gio Bernard as a possible guy to look at, but I did mention he was hurt in the week 3 game, and he did miss the week 4 game. I don't know that that's going to be a long injury, but keep an eye on it. And he is one of the backs that I actually am interested in Tampa. I guess the back to hold would be Leonard Fournette. But the fact of the matter is Tampa doesn't even run 30% of the time. And going into week 4, they actually were less than 25% of the time. And I don't know that I see that changing as long as Tom Brady is there. So if I want to own a back, I want to own a back that can catch passes out of the backfield. And that's Fournette to a lesser extent, and Bernard, who, if they get in a shootout, is probably going to be the guy they go to, especially if they have to come back. Jacobs may be back. So I mentioned Peyton Barber last week. I will run him into my lineup tonight if I have him as an injury replacement. But if Jacobs plays, I don't know that I'm going to even flex Barber. It depends on if I have an open spot or not. And the last name I gave you out of the running backs was James Conner. Now, he probably was not available in a lot of leagues, but yesterday he did have 20 more touches and even had a couple of receptions. And he also had 2 touchdowns. So it looks like he's probably the guy they're looking at if they don't want to run Kyler Murray, into the ground. So a guy running back that's given me 20 points and 20 touches is a guy that's at least a flex. I actually had to play him as my running back 2 yesterday in a deep league. So those guys, as far as I'm concerned, Connor and Hubbard are holds. Keep watching the other guys. Bernard absolutely is on watch list. Barber is being held as long as Jacobs is out, and maybe if you feel like holding on to him as insurance going forward. For wide receivers, my recommendation of the week is playing tonight. So we'll see how Hunter Renfrow does, and we'll revisit that next week. Emmanuel Sanders I talked about, and in a game where Buffalo threw less than they usually do because they were involved in such a blowout, Emmanuel Sanders still had 6 targets, 5 receptions, and 74 yards. And he is one of the deeper target guys in the league. I believe among wide receivers with at least 20 targets through 4 games. He is around 17 yards, which is, I believe, the highest of any receiver with that many targets. I also mentioned A.J. Green, and A.J. Green had another good game. He had 6 targets, 5 receptions, 67 yards, and another touchdown. It's not 2015 A.J. Green, but if I've got a flex spot that isn't performing, I would certainly consider him. And if you already have him, he's absolutely a hold. Cole Beasley had a down day yesterday, and somebody was going to in that offense. Like I said, they ran the ball 40 times yesterday. They're running a lot of plays a game. So that's an offense you want shares of just about everybody. And I still want Beasley. Beasley only had 2 targets yesterday, 2 receptions, 16 yards. He probably hurt you in your lineups, but I think more often than not, he will help. A guy that's probably not getting as much opportunity, and I hammer the point that opportunity is king in fantasy football if you can get it. Khalif Raymond had 2 touchdowns yesterday, but that was only on 6 targets and 3 receptions and 46 yards. Hugely efficient and not sustainable, but Khalif Raymond has had 16 targets the last 2 games, so at worst, he's a watch. I gave you Sammy Watkins as a watch. Sammy Watkins had 7 targets, 4 receptions, 49 yards. Not a huge point game, but the opportunity is going to be there for him. Maybe even when Rashad Bateman comes back, which seems to be within the next week to 3. They've already designated him for return. Told you if Antonio Brown was out, Tyler Johnson's a guy to keep an eye on. Well, Antonio Brown was back. So Tyler Johnson is not a guy to keep an eye on if all their receivers are healthy. He did have 2 targets last night, but he did not catch either one. I was lukewarm on Deshaun Jackson. I'm still lukewarm on Deshaun Jackson. He's not buried deep on my roster. He's buried deep on my watch list unless you're in a real deep league. He had 3 targets yesterday, 1 catch, 6 yards. He's the definition of a boomer bust player. He's long past his prime, but I suppose if you want to keep an eye on him and see if he gets more run in that offense, go ahead. I'm not super crazy about him either way. I mentioned last week Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and I did say he got injured at the end of the 49ers game, and now he is on short-term IR. Do with that what you will. It doesn't cost anything to have a guy on your watch list. And I will talk about a possible replacement for him if you have rostered him. The last guy I talked about among the wide receivers was Kendrick Bourne, and he had another reasonably effective game, and he looks like he's got some of a rapport with Mac Jones. He had 5 targets. He caught all 5 of them. He did have 58 yards, and I will keep an eye on him. They can't throw all the possession targets to Jacoby Myers, and I'm sure they would love to have Aguilar as a deep threat. That game last night was not conducive to deep passing. It rained about as hard as I've seen anywhere all year during that game in Boston last night. Let's talk about the tight ends I gave you. I gave you Dawson Knox. Dawson Knox is already up to about 50% owned, and he's owned in most of the leagues I'm in. But if for some reason he's out there and you've got a guy like Tunyon, I would certainly consider replacing him with Dawson Knox. Knox had 8 targets yesterday and caught 5 of them for 37 yards and 2 touchdowns. I gave you Tyler Conklin, and in a game that was the most mystifying of the day to me, where I expected it to be very high scoring, and it turned out to be a 14-7 game between Minnesota and Cleveland. Conklin did have 6 targets, which is good, and he did have 4 receptions, which is decent, but he only had 18 yards, and the Browns really put the clamps on the Minnesota offense yesterday. I think they're an effective offense. He's a guy I'm not running out to grab, but definitely looking at. And if for some reason, again, Mike Gesicki, as long as Jacoby Brissett is the quarterback, he had another good game yesterday in a game where the Dolphins only ran 49 plays, which is pretty abysmal. Gesicki had 6 targets, 5 receptions, 57 yards, and a touchdown. And I've really enjoyed owning him the last 2 weeks, much more than the first 2 weeks, where he had 0 points and about 7 points. Both the kickers I gave you last week, regrettably, were busts. I expected high-scoring games in the Denver game against Baltimore, and they managed just 1 touchdown. And in Minnesota, they also managed 1 touchdown against the Cleveland Browns. Both those guys were busts. They tried a combined 0 field goals, and they each had 1 extra point. So apologies there. I still am going to keep using my process. I'm not super crazy about recommending kickers and defenses anyway, but I will keep doing it. The defenses I recommended are the teams that were playing the New York teams, and both the New York teams won their first games yesterday. New Orleans gave up 27 points and only had 1 turnover, so they were a low-scoring team. I still like the Saints defense. Tennessee, actually, until late in the first half, they had shut out the Jets. And then after that, they gave up 27 points. They only had 1 sack and 1 turnover. So I will put them willingly in the kind of bust category. And as an extra bonus bust, I picked up Cincinnati in a few leagues, and that just fizzled. Somehow Jacksonville fixed their turnover problems all up in 1 game, which is great for Jacksonville, but it was horrible for me. 2 busts there, but again, I will talk about defenses going forward. Now that I have chastised myself, let's talk about some pickups and watches for week 5. In the quarterback category, I'm recommending Sam Darnold again. He's still criminally underowned. He is currently in the top 8 in points, makes him ownable in 1 quarterback leagues. And I've been pounding Daniel Jones' drum for a while. Yesterday, he had 402 yards passing, 27 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. He ran in a 2-pointer. He did have 1 pick, but so far through 4 games, he's only turned the ball over twice. And that has been one of the major black marks against owning Daniel Jones. Now, currently, both of those guys are outscoring Lamar Jackson, Aaron Rodgers, Joe Burrow and Ryan Tannehill, to name a few. All of those guys are widely owned, and I'm not going to tell you to drop Lamar Jackson and Aaron Rodgers, nor do I expect those guys to outscore Lamar and Aaron Rodgers for the season, but it's just to make a point that they are currently valuable. Sam Darnold has a pretty good schedule coming up, and I don't know that Daniel Jones is going to meet a defense that can truly stop him. I think he's his own worst enemy. So I like both those guys better than Burrow and better than Tannehill. So last week I told you to drop Matt Ryan, and Matt Ryan went out and threw 4 touchdowns yesterday. So if you want to pick Matt Ryan back up, knock yourself out. I think that was probably the outlier performance. So I like Darnold and I like Daniel Jones better than Burrow, better than Tannehill, and better than Matt Ryan. Now let's talk about some running backs. Of course, Damian Williams is probably the pickup of the week. Keep an eye on the David Montgomery situation. I am keeping my fingers crossed Montgomery is not hurt badly. I have him on a bunch of my rosters. I never root for injuries, but you need to have that insurance in case David Montgomery misses time. I would spend maybe 15 to 20% of my fab, maybe a top 5 to top 3 waiver claim on him. I'm not going all in on a guy that at least at this point looks like he might be a rental. A guy I've been talking about periodically on and off my show all year, Kenneth Gainwell, looks like he's getting closer to not only relevance, but arrival. Yesterday, he did only have 9 touches, but he had 3 carries for 31 yards and a touchdown, and he had 6 receptions, and I don't remember the yardage right off the top of my head, but I know he had north of 20 PPR points. J.D. McKissick looks like he's having his even odd year and will be relevant on the even weeks. But more accurately, he will be relevant when Washington is caught in a shootout, which looks like it might be fairly regularly, as the defense gave up 30 points again yesterday. And I recommended last week dropping them. And if you haven't, drop them. Drop that defense. I know you paid a decent price for them this year, but they are just not getting the job done. McKissick had 12 touches, 7 of them are actually on the ground. He had 5 targets, caught all 5 of them for 44 yards and a touchdown, and he had over 16 PPR points. A couple of guys I'm going to say keep an eye on in a game where the momentum swung back and forth. Tennessee's Jeremy McNichols was used heavily in the passing game. He had 12 targets yesterday. He caught 8 of them for 74 yards. That's something to keep an eye on. If he's going to get that kind of usage in the passing game, he is a viable flex option. Alex Collins is a name I've mentioned at least once here as a Pete Carroll guy for Seattle. And for some reason, Chris Carson and Alex Collins basically split the workload yesterday. Collins had 12 touches for 78 yards. He did have 2 receptions, and he had a touchdown. He outproduced Chris Carson. Now, I'm not saying drop Chris Carson and go get Alex Collins. Keep an eye on Alex Collins and see if he is going to be relevant going forward. Some of the week 4 wide receiver heroes and whether or not I think they're worth picking up. The first one is Randall Cobb had a big game, and it looks like Pittsburgh kind of sold out to keep Devontae Adams out of the end zone. So Randall Cobb with Marcus Valdez-Scantling out stepped up and showed why Aaron Rodgers made his return to the Packers contingent on them trading for Randall Cobb. And Randall Cobb had 6 targets, 5 receptions, 69 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Keep an eye on the situation. I'm not going to tell you not to pick him up if you want to put him on the end of your bench, even if you want to start him in a flex position, go ahead and do it. For me, he's a guy that I might pick up and hold. More likely, I'll keep him on my watch list. Van Jefferson is starting to get relevant in Los Angeles, and they're not going opponents of the Rams just aren't going to let Cooper Kupp continue to run wild all over the field, and they're already trying to hold down Robert Woods. And as the season goes on, Van Jefferson is starting to show some signs of life. Yesterday, he had 6 targets. He caught all 6 for 90 yards and a touchdown, which was his second touchdown in 4 games. And he's got 18 targets on the year. It's another guy to at least watch and consider for a flex position. I'm not saying run out and pick him up, but definitely look him over. I mentioned Khalif Raymond last week, and in the last 2 games, he has had 16 targets, 9 catches, 114 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Definitely worth at least a look. If you've got a spot on the end of your bench that isn't doing nothing, say a Ronald Jones, sure. If nobody else is out there, if none of the other guys I've talked about is out there, go put Khalif Raymond at least on your watch list and maybe on your roster. And a guy that I'm actually very curious about, especially if Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard continue to be out, is the Giants' number 20 2021 pick, who showed some signs of life yesterday. Kadarius Toney had 9 targets. He had 6 catches for 78 yards, and he even had a carry, only netted 1 yard. But if they start using him, and they're probably going to have to, I know I mentioned Colin Johnson last week, but he was probably a week 3 contingency, more than a going forward plan. Toney definitely got some usage in the game, and Kenny Golladay had his best day as a Giant and made some huge plays down the stretch. But I would even consider adding Toney to the end of my bench and seeing if he can grow this role. The tight end position, I've already mentioned Dawson Knox. I'm mentioning him here again. To me, he is a must-own at the position. And the other guy I have mentioned earlier, but I liked his running mate a little bit better for the Cowboys, is Dalton Schultz. And I am now making Dalton Schultz a must-add at tight end, especially if you have a guy that got hurt or is underperforming. Last 2 games for Dalton Schultz, 15 targets, 12 receptions, 138 yards, and most importantly, gold for the tight end position, 3 touchdowns. That is a very potent offense, and I imagine even in a game where Dak Prescott only threw 22 times, and he has not been throwing much since week 1. But I do like Dalton Schultz as an option going forward at the tight end position, especially if I'm not holding Hawkinson, Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, Kyle Pitts, Mark Andrews, one of those guys. Dalton Schultz is definitely a consideration. My kicker of the week is a guy I would actually grab if he's available and hold, and that is the Browns' Chase McLaughlin. He's been always a pretty reliable kicker, and even in a game where the Browns only scored 14 points, Chase McLaughlin did have 2 field goals, even if they decided to go for 2 on the touchdown they scored. So I think the Browns are open enough offense most weeks that McLaughlin's going to have a good role going forward, and I definitely love him for this week. He's available in a lot of leagues. And the defensive recommendations, the first one is the New England Patriots, and they are probably not widely available, but if they are, they get the Houston Texans this week, and the implied total on the Houston Texans is just over 15 points. They just got shut out by Buffalo. I am recommending streaming anybody you can against the Texans because they look like they are what we expected them to be at the beginning of the season. And the deep dive defense is the defense against the Jets. is the Atlanta Falcons. And I will take a chance on the Falcons in Atlanta with an implied total for the Jets of 18.5 points. That's pretty much going to wrap it up for the show this week. Be kind, be respectful to people when you talk to them. If you want to follow somebody on Twitter, follow 32in32 Fantasy Football at 32in32ff. And if you want to follow me, I am at CREWSER128. That's Cruiser 128. And have a great week, and I will see you here again next week.